Good evening, and today we shall continue our reading of Lombard Street by Walter Bagehot. You remember last time that we ended on Bagehot introducing the idea of the money market, and today we will talk about Lombard Street in general, what it is, how it works, etc. So, Chapter 2. A general view of Lombard Street. The objects which you see in Lombard Street, and in that money world which is grouped about it, are the Bank of England, the private banks, the joint stock banks, and the bill brokers. But before describing each of these separately, we must look at what all have in common, and at the relation of each to the others. The distinct function of the banker, says Ricardo, begins as soon as he uses the money of others. As long as he uses his own money, he is only a capitalist. And according to all the banks in Lombard Street and bill brokers are for this purpose only a kind of bankers, hold much money belonging to other people on running account and on deposit. In continental language, Lombard Street is an organization of credit, and we are to see if it is a good or bad organization in its kind, or if, as is most likely, it turned out to be mixed. What are its merits and what are its defects? The main point on which one system of credit differs from another is soundness. Credit means that a certain confidence is given and a certain trust reposed. Is that trust justified? And is that confidence wise? These are the cardinal questions. To put it more simply, credit is a set of promises to pay. Will those promises be kept? Especially in banking, where liabilities, or promises to pay, are so large and the time at which to pay them, if exacted, is so short, an instant capacity to meet engagements is the cardinal excellence. All which a banker wants to pay his creditors is a sufficient supply of the legal tender of the country, no matter what that legal tender may be. Different countries differ in their laws of legal tender, but for the primary purposes of banking, these systems are not material. A good system of currency will benefit the country, and a bad system will hurt it. Indirectly, bankers will be benefited or injured with the country in which they live. But practically, and for the purposes of their daily life, they have no need to think, and never do think, on theories of currency. They look at the matter simply. They say, I am under an obligation to pay such and such sums of legal currency. How much have I in my till, or have I at once under my command of that currency? In America, for example, it is quite enough for a banker to hold greenbacks, though the value of these changes as the government chooses to enlarge or contract the issue. Period prior to the resumption of specie. Hey, okay. So, we will talk about this when we actually talk about, when we go over the chapter and discuss it. To continue, but a practical New York banker has no need to think of the goodness or badness of the system at all. He need only keep enough greenbacks to pay all probable demands, and then he is fairly safe from the risk of failure. By the law of England, the legal tenders are gold and silver coin, the last for small amounts only, and Bank of England notes. But the number of our attainable banknotes is not, like American greenbacks, dependent on the will of the state. It is limited by the provisions of the Act of 1844. That act separates the Bank of England into two halves. The issue department only issues notes and can only issue £15 million on government securities. Okay. For all the rest, it must have bullion deposited. Take, for example, an account which may be considered an average specimen of those of the last few years. That of the last week of 1869, government debt. Okay, so the government issued that many. We'll go over this when the time comes. Yes, I'll have this as as a table, and we can discuss it on the on the whiteboard. So to continue, there are here 15 million banknotes issued on securities and 18,288,640 represented by bullion. The Bank of England has no power by law to increase the currency in any other manner. It holds the stipulated amount of securities, and for all the rest it must have bullion. This is the cast iron system, the hard and fast line which the opponents of the act say ruins us, and which the partisans of the act say saves us. But I have nothing to do with its expediency here. All which is to my purpose is that our paper legal tender, our banknotes, can only be obtained in this manner. If, therefore, an English banker retains a sum of Bank of England notes or coin in due proportion to his liabilities, he has a sufficient amount of the legal tender of this country, and he need not think of anything more. But here a distinction must be made. It is to be observed that, properly speaking, we should not include in the reserve of a bank legal tenders or cash, which the bank keeps to transact its daily business. That is as much part of its daily stock in trade as its desk or offices. Or at any rate, whatever words we may choose to use, we must carefully distinguish between this cash in the till, which is wanted for every day, and the safety fund, as we may call it, the special reserve held by the bank to meet extraordinary and unfrequent demands. What then, subject to this preliminary explanation, is the amount of legal tender held by our bankers against their liabilities? The answer is remarkable, and it is the key to our whole system. It may be broadly said that no bank in London or out of its holds any considerable sum in hard cash or legal tender above what is wanted for its daily business, except the banking department of the Bank of England. That department had, on the 29th day of December 1869, liabilities of £27,235,000 and a cash reserve of £11,297,000. And this is all the cash reserve, we must carefully remember, which, under law, the banking department of the Bank of England, as we cumbrously call it, the Bank of England for banking purposes, possesses. That department can no more multiply or manufacture banknotes than any other bank can multiply them. At that particular day, the Bank of England had only $11,297,000 in its till against liabilities of nearly 3 times the amount. It had consols and other securities which it could offer for sale, no doubt, and which, if sold, would augment its supply of banknotes. And the relation of such securities to real cash will be discussed presently. But of real cash, the Bank of England, for this purpose, the banking bank, had then so much and no more. And we may well think this a great deal, if we examine positions of other banks. No other bank holds any amount of substantial importance in its own till beyond what is wanted for daily purposes. All London banks keep their principal reserve on deposit at the banking department of the Bank of England. This is by far the easiest and safest place for them to use. The Bank of England, thus, has the responsibility of taking care of it. The same reasons which make it desirable for a private person to keep a banker make it also desirable for every banker, as respects his reserve, to bank with another banker if he safely can. The custody of very large sums in solid cash entails much care and some cost. Everyone wishes to shift these upon others if he can do so without suffering. Accordingly, the other bankers of London, having perfect confidence in the Bank of England, get that bank to keep their reserves for them. The London bill brokers do much the same. Indeed, they are the only special sort of bankers who allow daily interest on deposits, and who, for most of their money, give security. But we have no concern now with these differences in detail. The bill brokers lend most of their money and deposit the remnant either with the Bank of England or some London banker. That London banker lends what he chooses of it and the rest he leaves at the Bank of England. You always come back to the Bank of England at last. But those who keep immense sums with a banker gain a convenience at the expense of a danger. They are liable to lose them if the bank fails. As all other bankers keep their banking reserves at the Bank of England, they are liable to fail if it fails. They are dependent on the management of the Bank of England in a day of difficulty and at a crisis for the spare money they keep to meet that difficulty and crisis. And in this, there is considerable risk. 3 times Peel's Act has been suspended because the banking department was empty. In fact, in none of those years could the banking department of the Bank of England have survived if the law had not been broken. Nor must it be fancied that this danger is unreal, artificial, and created by law. There is a risk of our thinking so because we hear that the danger can be cured by breaking the act, but substantially, the same danger existed before the act. In 1825, when only coin was legal tender, and when there was only one department in the bank had reduced its reserves to £1,027,000 and was within an ace of stopping payment. But the danger to the depositing banks is not the sole or the principal consequence of this mode of keeping the London reserve. The main effect is to cause the reserve to be much smaller in proportion to the liabilities than it would otherwise be. The reserve of the London bankers being on deposit in the Bank of England, the bank always lends a principal part of it. Suppose a favorable supposition that the banking department holds more than 2/5 of its liabilities in cash, that it lends 3/5 of its deposits and retains in the reserve only 2/5. If then the aggregate of the bankers' deposited reserve be 5 million, 3 million of it will be lent by the banking department, and 2 million will be kept in the till. In consequence, that 2 million is all which is really held in actual cash as against the liabilities of the depositing banks. And if Lombard Street were on a sudden thrown into liquidation and made to pay as much as it could on the spot, that 2 million would be all which the Bank of England could pay to the depositing banks, and consequently all besides the small cash in the till, which those banks could on a sudden pay to the persons who have deposited with them. We see then that the banking reserve of the Bank of England, some £10 million on an average of years now, and formerly much less, is all which is held against the liabilities of Lombard Street. And if that were all, we might well be amazed at the immense development of our credit system. In plain English, at the immense amount of our debts payable on demand, and the smallness of the sum of actual money which we keep to pay them if demanded. But there's more to come. Lombard Street is not only a place requiring to keep a reserve, it is itself a place where reserves are kept. All country bankers keep their reserves in London. They only retain in each country town the minimum of cash necessary to the transaction of the current business of that country town. Long experience has told them to a nicety how much this is, and they do not waste capital and lose profit by keeping more idle. They send the money to London, invest a part of it in securities, and keep the rest with the London bankers and bill brokers. The habit of Scotch and Irish bankers is much the same. All their spare money is in London, and is invested as all other London money now is, and therefore the reserve in the banking department of the Bank of England is the banking reserve not only of the Bank of England, but of all London, and not only of all London, but of all England, Ireland, and Scotland too. Just a sip of water. Of late, there has been still further increase in our liabilities. Since the Franco-German War, we may be said to keep the European reserve also. Deposit banking is indeed so small on the continent that no large reserve need be held on account of it. A reserve of the same sort which is needed in England and Scotland is not needed abroad, but all great communities have at times to pay large sums in cash, and of that cash, a great store must be kept somewhere. Formerly, there were two such stores in Europe. One was the Bank of France, and the other was the Bank of England. But since the suspension of specie payments by the Bank of France, its use as a reservoir of specie is at an end. No one can draw a check on it and be sure of getting gold or silver for that check. Accordingly, the whole liability for such international payments in cash is thrown on the Bank of England. No doubt foreigners cannot take from us our own money. They must send here value, in some shape or other, for all they take away. But they need not send cash. They may send good bills and discount them in Lombard Street and take away any part of that produce, or all of that produce, in bullion. But it is only putting the same point in other words to say that all exchange operations are centering more and more in London. Formerly, for many purposes, Paris was a European settling house, but now it has ceased to do so. The note of the Bank of France has not indeed been depreciated enough to disorder ordinary transactions, but any depreciation, however small, even the liability to depreciation without its reality, is enough to disorder exchange transactions. They are calculated to such an extremity of fineness that the change of a decimal may be fatal and may turn a profit into a loss. Accordingly, London has become the sole great settling house of exchange transactions in Europe, instead of being formerly one of two. And this preeminence London will probably maintain, for it is a natural preeminence. The number of mercantile bills drawn upon London incalculably surpass those drawn on any other European city. London is the place which receives more than any other place, and pays more than any other place, and therefore it is the natural clearinghouse. The preeminence of Paris partly arose from a distribution of political power, which is already disturbed, but that of London depends on the regular course of commerce, which is singularly stable and hard to change. Now that London is the clearinghouse to foreign countries, London has a new liability to foreign countries. At whatever place many people have to make payments, at that place those people must keep money. A large deposit of foreign money in London is now necessary for the business of the world. During the immense payments from France to Germany, the sum in transitu, the sum in London, has perhaps been unusually large, but it will ordinarily be very great. The present political circumstances no doubt will soon change. We shall soon hold in Lombard Street far less of the money of foreign governments, but we shall hold more and more of the money of private persons, for the deposit at a clearinghouse necessary to settle the balance of commerce must tend to increase as that commerce itself increases. And this foreign deposit is evidently of a delicate and peculiar nature. It depends on the good opinion of foreigners, and that opinion may diminish or may change into bad opinion. After the Panic of 1866, especially after the suspension of Peel's Act, which many foreigners confound with the suspension of cash payments, a large amount of foreign money was withdrawn from London, and we may reasonably presume that in proportion as we augment the deposit of cash by foreigners in London, we augment both the chances and disasters of a run upon England. And if that run should happen, the bullion to meet it must be taken from the bank. There is no other large store in the country. The great exchange dealers may have little for their own purposes, but they have no store worth mentioning in comparison with this. If a foreign creditor is so kind as to wait his time and buy the bullion as it comes into the country, he may be paid without troubling the bank or distressing the money market. The German government has recently been so kind, it was in no respect afraid. But a creditor who takes fright will not wait, and if he wants bullion in a hurry, he must come to the Bank of England. In consequence, all our credit systems depends on the Bank of England for its security, on the wisdom of the directors of that one joint stock company. It depends whether England shall be solvent or insolvent. This may seem too strong, but it is not. All banks depend on the Bank of England, and all merchants depend on some banker. If a merchant have £10,000 at his banker's and wants to pay it to someone in Germany, he will not be able to pay it unless his banker can pay him, and the banker will not be able to pay if the Bank of England should be in difficulties and cannot produce his reserve. The directors of the bank are, therefore, in fact, if not in name, trustees for the public. To keep a banking reserve on their behalf, and it would naturally be expected either that they distinctly recognize this duty and engage to perform it, or that their own self-interest was so strong in the matter that no engagement was needed. But so far from there being a distinct undertaking on the part of the bank directors to perform this duty, many of them would scarcely acknowledge it, and some altogether deny it. Mr. Hankey, one of the most careful and most experienced of them, says in his book on the Bank of England, the best account of the practice and working of the bank which anywhere exists, I do not intend here to enter at any length on the subject of the general management of the bank, meaning the banking department, as the principle upon which the business is conducted does not differ, as far as I am aware, from that of any well-conducted bank in London. But as anyone can see by the published figures, the banking department of the Bank of England keeps a great reserve in banknotes and coin, between 30 and 50% of its liabilities, and the other banks only keep in banknotes and coin the bare minimum they need to open shop with. And such a constant difference indicates, I conceive, that the two are not managed on the same principle. The practice of the bank has, as we all know, been much and greatly improved. They do not now manage like the other banks in Lombard Street. They keep an altogether different kind and quantity of reserve, but though the practice is mended, the theory is not. Quick moment. There has never been a distinct resolution passed by the directors of the Bank of England and communicated by them to the public, stating even in the most general manner how much reserve they mean to keep or how much they do not mean, or by what principle in this important manner they will be guided. The position of the bank directors is indeed most singular. On the one side, a great city opinion, a great national opinion, I may say, for the nation has learned much from many panics, requires the directors to keep a large reserve. The newspapers, on behalf of the nation, are always warning the directors to keep it and watching that they do keep it. But on the other hand, another less visible but equally constant pressure pushes the directors in exactly the reverse way and inclines them to diminish the reserve. This is the natural desire of all directors to make a good dividend for their shareholders. The more money lying idle, the less caeteris paribus is the dividend. The less money lying idle, the greater is the dividend. And at almost every meeting, the proprietors of the Bank of England, there is conversation on this subject. Some proprietor says that he does not see why so much money is kept idle, and hints that the dividend ought to be more. Indeed, it cannot be wondered at that the bank proprietors do not quite like their position. Theirs is the oldest bank in the city, but their profits do not increase while those of other banks most rapidly increase. In 1844, the dividend on the stock of the Bank of England was 7%, and the price of the stock itself 212. The dividend now is 9%, and the price of the stock 232. But in the same time, the shares of the London and Westminster Bank, in spite of an additional 100% to the capital, have risen from 27 to 66, and the dividend from 6 to 20%. That the bank proprietors should not like to see the other companies getting richer than their company is only natural. Some part of the lowness of the bank dividend and of the consequent small value of bank stock is undoubtedly caused by the magnitude of the bank capital, but much of it is also due to the great amount of unproductive cash, which yields no interest, that the banking department of the Bank of England keeps lying idle. If we compare the London and Westminster Bank, which is the first of the joint stock banks in the public estimation and known to be very cautiously and carefully managed, with the Bank of England, we shall see the difference at once. The London and Westminster has only 13% of its liabilities lying idle. The banking department of the Bank of England has over 40%. So great a difference in management must cause and does cause a great difference in their profits. Inevitably, the shareholders of the Bank of England will dislike this greater difference more or less. They will always urge their directors to diminish, as far as possible, the unproductive reserve and to augment, as far as possible, their own dividend. In most banks, there would be a wholesome dread restraining the desire of the shareholders to reduce the reserve. They would only fear to impair the credit of the bank. But fortunately, or unfortunately, no one has any fear about the Bank of England. The English world, at least, believes that it will not, almost that it cannot, fail. 3 times since 1844 that the banking department has received assistance and would have failed without it. In 1825, the entire concern almost suspended payment. In 1797, it actually did so. But still, there is a faith in the bank contrary to experience and despising evidence. No doubt in every one of these years, the condition of the bank, divided or undivided, was in a certain sense most sound. It could ultimately have paid all of its creditors all it owed and returned to its shareholders all their own capital. But ultimate payment is not what the creditors of a bank want. They want present, not postponed payment. They want to be repaid according to agreement. The contract was that they should be paid on demand, and if they are not paid on demand, they may be ruined. And that instant payment, in the years I speak of, the Bank of England certainly could not have made, but no one in London ever dreams of questioning the credit of the bank, and the bank never dreams that its own credit is in danger. Somehow, everybody feels the bank is sure to come right. In 1797, when it had scarcely any money left, the government said not only that it need not pay away what remained, but that it must not. The effect of letters of license to break Peel's Act has confirmed the popular conviction that the government is close behind the bank and will help it when wanted. Neither the bank nor the banking department have ever had any idea of being put into liquidation. Most men would think as soon of winding up the English nation. Since then, the Bank of England, as a bank, is exempted from the perpetual apprehension that makes other bankers keep a large reserve, the apprehension of discredit. It would seem particularly necessary that its managers should be themselves specifically interested in keeping that reserve, and specially competent to keep it. But I need not say that the bank directors have not their personal fortune at stake in the management of the bank. They are rich city merchants, and their stake in the bank is trifling in comparison to the rest of their wealth. If the bank were wound up, most of them would hardly in their income feel the difference. And what is more, the bank directors are not trained bankers. They were not bred to the trade and do not in general give the main power of their minds to it. They are merchants, most of whose time and most of whose real mind are occupied in making money in their own business and for themselves. Another sip of water. It might be expected that, as this great public duty was cast upon the banking department of the bank, the principal statesmen, if not Parliament itself, would have enjoined them to perform it. But no distinct resolution of Parliament has ever enjoined it. Scarcely any stray word of any influential statesman. And, On the contrary, there's a whole catena of authorities, beginning with Sir Robert Peel and ending with Mr. Lowe, which say that the banking department of the Bank of England is only a bank like any other bank. A company like other companies, in that in this capacity it has no peculiar position and no public duties at all. 9/10 of English statesmen, if they were asked as to the management of the banking department of the Bank of England, would reply that it was no business of theirs or of Parliament at all, that the banking department alone must look to it. The result is that we have placed the exclusive custody of our entire banking reserve in the hands of a single board of directors not particularly trained for the duty, who might be called amateurs, who have no particular interest above other people in keeping it undiminished, who acknowledge no obligation to keep it undiminished, who have never been told by any great statesman or public authority that they are so to keep it, or that they have anything to do with it, who are named by and are agents for a proprietary which they would have a greater income if it was diminished, who do not fear, who need not fear ruin, even if it were all gone and wasted. That such an arrangement is strange must be plain, but its strangeness can only be comprehended when we know what the custody of a national banking reserve means and how delicate and difficult it is. Ooh. All right. I think 5 more minutes? 5 more minutes. Such a reserve, as we have seen, is kept to meet sudden and unexpected demands. If the bankers of a country are asked for much more than is commonly wanted, then this reserve must be resorted to. What then are these extra demands, and how is this extra reserve to be used? Speaking broadly, these extra demands are of 2 kinds. One from abroad, to meet foreign payments requisite to pay large and unusual foreign debts, and the other from at home, to meet sudden apprehension or panic arising in any manner, rational or irrational. No country has ever been so exposed as England to a foreign demand on its banking reserve, not only because at present England is a large borrower from foreign nations, but also, and much more, because no nation has ever had a foreign trade of such magnitude, in such varied objects, or so ramified through the world. The ordinary foreign trade of a country requires no cash. The exports on one side balance the imports on the other. But a sudden trade of import, like the import of foreign corn after a bad harvest, or what is much less common, though there are cases of it, the cessation of any great export, causes a balance to become due, which must be paid in cash. Now, the only source from which large sums of cash can be withdrawn in countries where banking is at all developed is a bank reserve. In England, especially, except a few sums of no very considerable amount held by bullion dealers in the course of their business, there are no sums worth mentioning in cash out of the banks. An ordinary person could hardly pay a serious sum without going to some bank, even if he spent a month trying. All persons who wish to pay a large sum in cash trench of necessity on the banking reserve. But then, what is cash? Within a country, the action of a government can settle the quantity and therefore the value of its currency. But outside its own country, no government can do so. Bullion is the cash of international trade. Paper currencies are of no use here, and coins pass only as they contain more or less bullion. We will talk about that when we talk about the chapter. Thank you. When, then, the legal tender of a country is purely metallic, all that is necessary is that banks should keep a sufficient store of that legal tender. But when the legal tender is partly metal and partly paper, it is necessary that the paper legal tender, the banknote, should be convertible into bullion. And here I should pass my limits and enter on the theory of Peel's Act if I begin to discuss the conditions of convertibility. I deal only with the primary prerequisite of effectual foreign payments, a sufficient supply of the local legal tender with the afterstep, the change of local legal tender into universally accepted commodity, I cannot deal. What I have to deal with is, for the present, ample enough. The Bank of England must keep a reserve of legal tender to be used for foreign payments if it itself fit, and to be used in obtaining bullion if itself unfit. And foreign payments are sometimes very large and often very sudden. The cotton drain, as it is called, the drain to the east to pay for Indian cotton during the American Civil War, took many millions from this country for a series of years. A bad harvest must take millions in a single year. In order to find such great sums, the Bank of England requires the steady use of an effectual instrument. That instrument is the elevation of the rate of interest. If the interest of money be raised, it is proved by experience that money does come to Lombard Street, and theory shows that it ought to come. To fully explain the matter, I must go deep into the theory of exchanges, but the general notion is plain enough. Loanable capital, like every other commodity, comes where there is most to be made of it. Continental bankers and others instantly send great sums here, as soon as the rate of interest shows that it can be done so profitably. While English credit is good, a rise of the value of money in Lombard Street immediately by a banking operation brings money to Lombard Street. And there is also a slower mercantile operation. The rise in the rate of discount acts immediately on the trade of this country. Prices fall here. In consequence, imports are diminished, exports are increased, and therefore, there is more likelihood of a balance in bullion coming to this country after the rise in the rate than there was before. Whatever persons, one bank or many banks in any country hold the banking reserve of that country, ought at the very beginning of an unfavorable foreign exchange at once to raise the rate of interest, so as to prevent the reserve from being diminished farther, and so as to replenish it by import of bullion. This duty, up to about year 1860, the Bank of England did not perform at all, as I shall show further on. A more miserable history can hardly be found than that of the attempts of the bank, if indeed they can be called attempts, to keep a reserve and to manage a foreign drain between the year 1819, when cash payments were resumed by the bank, and when our modern money market may be said to begin, and the year 1857. The panic of that year for the first time taught the bank directors wisdom and converted them to sound principles. The present policy of the bank is an infinite improvement on the policy before 1857. The two must not be for an instant confounded, but nevertheless, as I shall hereafter show, the present policy is now still most defective, and much discussion and much effort will be wanted before that policy becomes what it ought to be. Whew. And with that, we're done for tonight. Thank you very much for watching, or rather in this case listening. In conclusion, please download Firefox, don't do Chrome, and I hope I have not wasted 38 minutes of